Thank you. Thank you to the 11 wonderful presenters. We give you a loud virtual round of applause. Those were great talks and shows the diversity of talent and expertise and energy that's available here at BU. It's really an embarrassment of riches. So thank you all for all the work you do. It's worth noting that there's a number of people that, we had more potential speakers than we could actually fit into this session. So there's at least 6 or 7 or 8 more people that we could have put under this umbrella. So thank you to those that presented, but thank you to the broader group that works closely on this topic. So before we move into the question and answer period, I love seeing what's been going on in the chat. That's good, and I already see collaborations forming and discussions planned. But I'd like to welcome Benjaminzov to the discussion. So Benjamin was just hired earlier this month, and so Benjamin, if you'd like to introduce yourself, and maybe you can launch in with the first question.
Thanks very much, Greg, and nice to meet everyone. Benjaminzov here, fresh off the boat, as they used to say, from the United Kingdom, although it was actually an airplane. Started in January 1st, and I'm trying to lead the new Institute for Sustainable Energy as it transforms into a university-wide sustainability initiative. But I'm going to decline, Greg, asking any more questions because I've kind of been abusing the chat. So I've asked enough questions. I'm more than happy to put it back to others, but it's very nice to be here. Thank you.
Fair enough. Well, a very warm welcome to you. I know a number of us are looking forward to seeing what you do with the ISE and collaborating with you as well. So one of the themes that really emerged here for me is if I go back to something John Holdren said. John Holdren was the director of the White House Office of Science Technology Policy under President Obama. And in a talk I saw him give, he said, look, climate change is going to lead, we're going to have some mitigation, we're going to have some adaptation, and we're going to have pain. And the question is only how much mitigation and adaptation we do, and the leftover is going to be pain. And what I see here across these talks and the broader university community is the push to drive more mitigation, as Dennis showed us, drive more adaptation, as we saw several examples, in order to reduce the pain that we're doing a nice job documenting. So I think I want to start the discussion on what do we need to do? Where are areas where we've been successful, where individuals of you have been successful in moving out of the academic ivory tower and into the public space? And Lucy, maybe I'm going to call on you first, because you mentioned you've been working with the city of Boston closely and had success there. So maybe you could talk about a little bit about what's been really successful there, what you think the key ingredients are to success in moving beyond academia and into actually making a difference in the policy space.
If I were to give a single answer to that, I think it's to stop and listen. In the collaboration that I described in my talk today, as well as some of the others that have been most fruitful, it's to ask, what do they really want to know that they don't know? Being at a university with so much disciplinary depth, we can often answer questions and do analyses that are well beyond the scope of what practitioners can realistically try to do, but they often have data streams and information that are like a gold mine to us. And in the case of the BDPA example that I described today, we never would have done the analysis I described. We would have done a completely different project that had a lot more physics in it and was a lot less usable. And instead, it was listening to their feedback on what kind of information could they actually use. And in the end, I think that project for Ian will yield 2 papers, one of which will be a scientific paper on the statistical model that he tested and validated across a suite of US cities. And the other will be about the experience of working with the BDPA and creating a tool that was actually usable.
That's great. I love that. Patricia, maybe you can build on that. I know you've been working a lot with the city of Chelsea, and that, help us understand maybe the gap between sort of the, what we value as academic research versus what the community you're engaging with there values as answers to the most relevant questions.
Yeah, happy to. So I 100% agree with Lucy, is listening is one thing. I think also sitting at the table with all different kinds of partners. So in the case of City of Chelsea, It's going to the city sustainability meetings. It's going to the Green Roots organization meetings. It's just, again, it's part of listening, but listening to multiple stakeholders and then trying to align really well sort of what you have as an academic, whether it's data analysis, et cetera, with what could be useful to them in the short term, because communities and organizations, they're trying to make decisions quickly. It's not in 2 years when your paper's published. So I do think something that's been really successful is thinking about research on 2 tracks. One, kind of the typical slow moving research, right, that maybe has more novelty around the technology or methods, et cetera, but kind of in parallel be engaging with kind of practical solutions at the time that the community and city needs it. And I think that makes for strong partnerships. You end up helping with decision making, even if it's not the most novel method. But then you also then can kind of on your grant schedule, be also productive as an academic.
A tough balance to do that on those different timescales and competing priorities. And Amelia, if I can push you a little bit on that, because you're the Presto cohort and some of the other data sets you work with are really connecting with individuals. And so how amenable do you think sort of women trying to become pregnant are to either the information that you might generate of the risks of something like, days of extreme heat, or amenable to interventions you might propose?
That's a great question, and something that I've been thinking a lot about in terms of moving beyond the etiologic research, which is most of what I've been doing, into the intervention space, is kind of to build off what Lucy was saying, talking to people and listening to them, and how can we maybe implement some mixed methods type of research to get at what are the challenges that people face in terms of being exposed to these climate hazards, and what would actually work in their lives in terms of exposure reduction.
Yeah, that's great. And I see there's a question in the chat of, once a finding or solution is developed in collaboration with the city or a particular community, what are the paths to making that information solution available to other cities or locales? So that's a great question, and I'll open up to any of the panelists that want to respond to that. Is how do we learn from each other so that the great work we do in Boston or in Chelsea or with this niche population actually not sort of just end there, but actually be something we can learn for the future? Anybody want to take that on?
I'll maybe say a first few couple of words, which is, I think we need to go beyond publishing in the academic literature first and foremost. Mm-hmm. That may be what we're rewarded for in the tenure system and everything else, but that is not an effective pathway to reach the practitioners. So I think we need to be both publishing in a detailed, rigorous way in the academic literature, but also publishing in other venues and communicating it through other pathways to get that information out.
And I could add to that as well, Greg. I think what Lucy said was spot on, and I'll just say it's also about training our students. So many of us were trained how to publish in peer-reviewed journals, but our students are hungry for solution-oriented training. They're here because they want to get degrees, so they want to be experts in their field, but it's possible to do both. We're seeing that by training students in their disciplines to be experts and training them to work with partners. So for us in the urban program, they do hands-on partnerships with governments, private sector, NGOs. I think that's a way to make this model bigger, so it's not just a one-off project, but we're hopefully putting people out in the world who could do this in a much broader way.
Yeah, I just want to maybe add on to what Pam and Lucy said. And I think that in previous work that I've done looking at the development and implementation of heat action plans to try and mitigate some of the impacts of extreme heat, my experience has been in more of a global health context focused in India. But I do think that capacity building is one of the key components of that. I think another thing that I'd like to highlight is that building out the capability of local partners to evaluate the effectiveness of those solutions and provide evidence that in the period following implementation of these solutions that they're actually working in the way that we think they should be working, and helping the populations that we think are the most vulnerable to periods of extremes, whether it's temperature or other types of climate relevant extremes. I think that provides really compelling framework for other communities to take up those same activities and those same policies. So I think that that version of capacity building is also really critical for this effort.
That's great, thank you. So Peter, maybe you can chime in there on the role of education, which is, you're at an, we have BU Urban at the doctoral level. Your work with Globe is substantially earlier than that. But tell us about the role of education particularly on climate change, and how you hope that has the lasting impact we're looking for.
Well, first thing is today we were at a high school talking to students about doing urban heat island measurements and engaging them in questions about air quality and water quality and the kinds of measurements that they can make. I'm both delighted in the fact that they know lots about the problems with carbon dioxide, but for the most part, these students are unaware of anything to do with microclimates or anything to do with trees being of use and vegetation. They don't understand the science behind it. So the first thing that we're aiming at is to engage them in understanding their local environment. It would be very nice to have an army of these guys out there working, taking data for useful projects in their communities. Project Urban has been, we're working with Evan Kuras from the Urban Project, and we're hoping that the doctoral trainees will be subject matter experts who can go into the classrooms and discuss with the students and maybe mentor them on projects. So I think that's the connection that I can talk about right now. I wish also that we could be doing more citizen science in different neighborhoods. That's something else that Globe really encourages. And the Globe Observer app makes it now so easy to take data and submit data. So Greg, that's about the range of what I can say.
No, well, so one, thank you. That's excellent. Two, there's I'm aware of a number of efforts led by different government agencies to map the urban heat island with ground-based measures in detail across several cities in the U.S. And that strikes me as oftentimes they've used citizen science to do that, but there's no reason that couldn't be driven through a school-based project as well. With an army of volunteers, having high schoolers myself, I can attest to their passion and dedication for these things when you hit the right chord. So Josh, maybe we can continue on the theme of learning for a moment. So your results incredibly interesting, and I wonder how you see the recent interest and enthusiasm for improving ventilation in schools and otherwise investing in school infrastructure is going to, is that potentially helpful for the heat and learning connection, or are those orthogonal because they have different goals?
No, I don't think they're orthogonal at all. I actually think that in some sense, the series of crises that have happened, over the last couple of years and in the longer run have, in some sense come together to make it much clearer that improving school ventilation and temperature control and sort of improving that aspect of school infrastructure at this point really seems a bit like a no-brainer. You pandemic-proof schools, you climate change-proof schools, and frankly, you make schools into the kind of physical places that we expect sort of professional offices to be. None of us would be happy working at BU if we didn't have the ability to control the temperature in our offices. And I say this as someone who, our building yesterday was 85 to 90 degrees, and it was a problem for our productivity. And if that were a long-run issue, it would be hard to recruit and retain students and faculty here and to get our work done. So I really think of this as really getting to the point where we think of schools in the same way we think of all other workspaces. What do we do to make them sort of effective and make the spaces get out of the way of the tasks people want to do, as opposed to getting in the way of them.
Yeah, love it. And Arunima, from thinking about the research and the learning, and then dissemination of that information, then you talked about disinformation. Disinformation cuts both ways. It's like, it's not necessarily that all disinformation serves one particular purpose. It can serve a variety of different purposes. So we've seen that certainly with COVID. Can you dig in a little bit further into your research? Are there different types of disinformation that are either more prevalent or more that people are more susceptible to? Sort of the climate change is a hoax, that type of disinformation, is that more likely to be effective than, oh yes, climate change is real, but it doesn't matter, it's not going to harm us? Can you talk a little bit about the types of disinformation?
Absolutely. So in this particular study, the focus was on climate change disinformation writ large. And so I had questions included about climate change is not real, as well as about how climate and weather are the same. And in fact, interestingly, there were some pieces of disinformation that resonated not just with climate change deniers, but also with climate change believers. So there is some level of inoculation that is required as well, and we can draw upon inoculation theory to do that kind of work. And talking about disinformation just beyond climate change, I do have some work that I've done on misinformation. So the difference being that disinformation is false information disseminated with the intention of misrepresenting or with malicious intentions. I have work that I'm actually presenting at the next Research on Tap, cheap plug for the next one, where I'm talking about the nature of misinformation, and how misinformation can be insidious, and how it takes root in people's minds, and why it does so. Specifically with climate change, we know that there are several studies, white papers out there about how certain lobbies have shelled out a whole lot of money to cast doubt onto climate change science, about how scientists are doing it for the money, about how scientists don't know that scientists can't predict the weather tomorrow, and therefore they cannot possibly predict the climate in the future. And so the conflation of the terms weather and climate is something that really resonates not just with climate change deniers, but also with believers, which is a little bit scary. So I have another study on that unpacks those differences between deniers and believers, and how they have accepted disinformation messages.
Wonderful, thank you. And Ian, I want to come back to something you said, sort of as we increase air conditioning adoption. In a separate meeting we had this morning, the point was raised that surely as the world warms, we need less energy dedicated to heating in the winter, so heating degree days. And I know you've done some research on sort of the net emissions that might come from that, sort of as reduced heating demand but increased cooling demand. Could you touch a little bit on that, or is this just a net cost?
It's going to be a net cost because we haven't done the emissions. That's what we're working on right now, and that's the important part, because you use less energy to heat yourself, more energy to cool yourself, and what we find is that in energy terms, not in dollar terms, not in CO2 terms, but in energy terms, we come out behind. You use more than you save, right? The ultimate consequences for the climate depends on how we choose to satisfy that increase in demand during the summer. If it's renewables, great. If it's coal, we'll cook.
Yeah. All right, great, thank you. I'm going to open up the floor. I've been dominating the Q&A. There's been some really great questions coming on the chat, but if anybody wants to unmute themselves and ask a broad or specific question, please take a moment to do so now. And maybe Pat Kinney, I see you're on the call there. Maybe I can call on you to sort of give your perspective on everything you've heard today, because you've been, you're one of the early leaders in the field, specifically of climate and health, and really one of the, you've been named in the auspicious list as one of the top scientists in the field. So I don't know if you are available to unmute yourself and give us your thoughts.
Thanks, Greg, and thanks to all of you guys for organizing this incredible session. It's so impressive to see what's been blossoming at BU over the last few years, just congratulations to all of you, particularly to Greg for shepherding the climate and health program, which has been, I think, just officially out there for about a year or so, and it's just incredible to see what's happening. I think it's really interesting to see all the impressive work on health impacts that was presented today. It's going in lots of really interesting directions. I would also just note that another thread of work that is going on at the School of Public Health, particularly, is focusing on health benefits of climate action, which I think is also quite relevant. And I think a lot of the work we heard about today is, sort of relates to that, especially some of the work engaging with the city. So I'll stop there. Again, congratulations, great work.
Great, thank you, Pat. So let's see, with that, maybe let's close the Q&A. I think there's a terrific energy here. I encourage individuals, participants and panelists to reach out to each other as useful to continue this conversation. And I encourage us all to gather in the spring when we can do so safely to continue the learning from each other. And with that, Dr. Waters, thank you again for enabling this, and I turn it back to you.
So Greg, thanks for organizing this. To echo what Pat said, this was a really impressive set of talks, really nice to hear all the work that's happening here. And yeah, just you chose a very interesting selection of work. And I know that there's a lot more other interesting work happening at BU, but really nice to hear these talks. I guess one thing that really surprised me about this was, we're concerned about the virtual format, but I have to say the chat is the on tap part of this research on tap. I'm really impressed at how many connections people have made in the chat. So yeah, I really do encourage you all to continue the conversations that have started over there. But that doesn't mean that we won't get together in person to have the on tap portion of this at some point. And so I just do want to say that the next Research on Tap is on Thursday, February 10th from 4 to 5:30. And it's actually on the topic of health misinformation and how that affects society and how we can deal with it. So I think a lot of you will be interested in that topic also. So hope to see you at the next Research on Tap. But thanks so much, everybody. This was really terrific. Thanks, Greg, especially. Yeah.
My pleasure. Thank you. And Brian and your staff, thank you for organizing and facilitating. And with that, good night, everybody, and see you soon.
Thanks.